I thought working the night shift at a summer camp would be easy, just keeping an eye on the cabins, the lake, and the woods. But on my first night, they handed me a list of rules, rules so bizarre, so terrifying, I couldn't believe anyone would take them seriously. Don't whistle after midnight. Never look into Cabin 7's window. And whatever you do, never answer if you hear your name being called from the forest. I laughed at first, but then the rules started making sense when I saw what happens if you break them. Welcome, dear listeners, to another night by the fire. Grab a blanket, settle into the shadows, and let the crackle of the flames keep you company. But don't get too comfortable, because tonight's story isn't just any tale. It's a warning, wrapped in whispers and strange rules you must never break. Cozy up close, but remember, darkness listens too. When I first applied for the job at Camp Carnage, I didn't think much about the name. In fact, it almost felt like a joke. What kind of camp kept a name like that? I assumed it was some ironic branding, a leftover from the 60s when dark humor was fashionable. Or maybe a gimmick to attract the kinds of teenagers who thought ghosts and campfire stories were fun. The flyer hadn't said much, just that they needed a night clerk to watch over the grounds during the off-season. The pay was decent, the shift quiet, and the only requirements were that I had to be reliable, stay alert, and follow the camp's rules. I thought it would be easy money. The camp itself was deep in the Oregon woods, nearly 2 hours from the nearest town. My bus dropped me off at a long gravel road swallowed by evergreens, and from there I walked. By the time I reached the gate, I was out of breath, dragging my suitcase, the chill of dusk seeping into my jacket. A crooked wooden sign stood above the entrance. Camp Carnage, EST 1954. The letters were faded, the paint flaking, but the name was unmistakable. An older man was waiting for me in front of the main office. He was tall, with sunken eyes and a voice that rasped as though every word cost him effort. He introduced himself simply as Mr. Lawson, the camp manager. He didn't shake my hand, didn't smile, didn't even ask about my trip. He just handed me a folder and said, "Read this before your first shift." I flipped the folder open as he unlocked the office. Inside was a stapled packet of yellowed papers. At first glance, it looked like an ordinary employee handbook, but the first page stopped me cold. In bold letters it read, "Rules of the Night Clerk, Camp Carnage." I scanned down the list. 1. Do not leave the office between 12 a.m. and 2:33 a.m. 2. If you hear children laughing, do not investigate. 3. Keep the lights in the rec hall on at all times. If they go out, turn them back on immediately. 4. Do not acknowledge the girl in the red dress if you see her near the lake. 5. When the bell rings, lock the office door and wait until silence returns. 6. Never, under any circumstances, look out the window facing cabin 6. I stared at the paper, waiting for Lawson to explain. He didn't. He just sat behind the desk, filling out some paperwork of his own. Finally, I cleared my throat and asked if this was supposed to be some kind of joke. He looked up slowly, his eyes sharp and flat, and said, "You'll understand soon enough." That was the only answer I got. The rest of the evening passed in silence. He showed me the layout of the camp, the cabins, the rec hall, the mess hall, the trails that wound through the woods. It all looked abandoned, a skeleton of summer fun left to rot through the wet Oregon autumn. The cabins were empty, their windows dark. The lake was still, reflecting the deepening gray of the sky. The woods pressed in on all sides, dense and endless. When Lawson left, he locked the outer gate and drove off without another word. Suddenly, I was alone. My shift didn't officially start until 10, but I was already nervous. At 10 sharp, I settled into the office. It was a small building with 2 desks, some old filing cabinets, and a bank of dusty windows. One of those windows faced directly toward cabin 6. I tried not to look at it. The first hour was uneventful. I flipped through some old magazines left on the desk, made myself a cup of coffee, and tried to convince myself that the rules were just an elaborate prank to keep new hires on edge. The woods were silent outside, save for the wind. Occasionally I thought I heard faint noises, branches snapping, maybe the distant call of an owl, but nothing unusual. Then, around midnight, I heard it. Children laughing. It drifted through the woods like a breeze, faint but distinct, high-pitched and playful. For a moment I froze, the coffee mug halfway to my lips. There were no children here, not in the off-season, not out in these woods. Yet the laughter came again, closer this time, as though circling the office. The rules echoed in my mind. If you hear children laughing, do not investigate. I tried to shake it off. It had to be the wind, or maybe a recording, someone messing with me. But the longer I sat there, the more I realized it wasn't random. The laughter moved. It shifted from one side of the building to the other, rising and falling as though unseen children were running just outside my window. I gripped the edge of the desk until my knuckles ached. Every instinct told me to peek outside, just to prove to myself that no one was there. But the rules were clear. I forced myself to stay put. The laughter eventually faded, swallowed by the night. But I didn't feel relief. If anything, I felt watched, as though the sound had been a test and I had barely passed. At 12:47 a.m., the lights in the rec hall flickered. I noticed it out of the corner of my eye, a faint glow dimming in the distance. I remembered the third rule: keep the lights in the rec hall on at all times. If they go out, turn them back on immediately. I didn't want to go outside. Every bone in my body screamed against it. But I also didn't want to break the rules. Grabbing the flashlight from the desk, I stepped out into the cold night air. The gravel crunched under my boots as I made my way across the camp. The rec hall loomed ahead, its windows glowing faintly as the lights continued to flicker. The laughter was gone, but the woods felt heavier, pressing in with a silence that was almost suffocating. I pushed open the door. The lights sputtered, dimmed, and then went out entirely, leaving me in darkness. My flashlight beam cut across rows of dusty tables and stacked chairs. The air was stale, heavy with the smell of mildew. I found the breaker box near the back wall and flipped the switches. For a moment, nothing happened. Then, with a faint hum, the fluorescent bulbs above flickered back to life, buzzing like angry insects. Relieved, I turned back toward the door and froze. Someone was standing at the far end of the hall. A little girl. She wore a red dress, tattered and stained, her hair long and dark. Her face was pale, her eyes unreadable from the distance. She didn't move. She just watched me. The rules screamed in my head. Do not acknowledge the girl in the red dress if you see her near the lake. But this wasn't the lake. This was inside the rec hall. My breath caught in my throat. I lowered my flashlight, not daring to shine it directly at her, not daring to speak. I walked to the door, every step echoing in the silence, and forced myself not to look back. When I reached the office again, I locked the door, collapsed into the chair, and tried to steady my shaking hands. The rules weren't a joke. They weren't a prank. Something was here. At exactly 2:33 a.m., the air in the office shifted. The pressure lifted, and for the first time all night, the silence felt natural again. The woods were still, the lights steady, no laughter in the distance. I checked the clock. The forbidden window of time had passed. But I didn't sleep. I didn't close my eyes, because I knew the rules were real, and I had barely survived my first night. The next evening, when I returned to the camp office, I told myself I had imagined most of it. Maybe the stress of starting a new job had played tricks on me. Maybe the laughter had been coyotes. Maybe the girl had been a shadow in the rec hall, my tired mind filling in the rest. But deep down, I didn't believe that. When I arrived at the gate, Mr. Lawson was there again, as though waiting for me. He didn't ask how my first night went. He didn't even greet me. He simply unlocked the office, handed me a thermos of coffee, and said, "Remember the rules." Then he left. That was it. No conversation, no instructions beyond what I already knew, just the rules. The second night began quietly enough. I settled in at the desk, the same faint hum of the heater filling the room, the same stack of old papers and coffee rings staining the surface. My eyes kept drifting to the window facing cabin 6. I kept catching myself staring, almost as if daring something to happen, but I forced myself to look away. At 11:30, I heard the wind rising through the trees, sharp and whistling, the kind of wind that made the wooden beams creak and the gravel outside scatter. But this wasn't just wind. The sound was too rhythmic. It was whistling, a tune, slow and deliberate, weaving through the night air. Someone or something was outside, moving along the cabins. I tensed, gripping the desk, waiting to hear it fade. Instead, the sound grew louder. The whistling came closer, winding toward the office. I thought of the rules. None of them mentioned whistling. None of them prepared me for this. The tune stopped right outside the window. My skin crawled. I stared at the desk, refusing to lift my head, refusing to look. I knew if I looked, I would see someone standing there. Maybe not a person. Maybe not even something I could understand. Seconds passed. Then minutes. The silence was heavier than the sound had been. Finally, the whistling picked up again, drifting away into the woods. I let out a shaky breath I hadn't realized I was holding, but I couldn't shake the feeling that the rules had left something out. At 12:12 a.m., the office bell rang. I didn't even know there was a bell. The sharp clang reverberated through the small room, making my teeth ache. My pulse spiked. I remembered the fifth rule. When the bell rings, lock the office door and wait until silence returns. My hands scrambled for the key. The lock clicked shut. I sank into the chair and held my breath. The bell rang again, louder this time, as though right above my head. My ears rang with the force of it. I covered them with my palms, but it didn't help. Then came the footsteps. They crunched over the gravel outside, slow and deliberate, circling the office. My heart hammered in my chest. The sound of knuckles rapped against the door once, then twice, and then a voice. "Let me in." It was a woman's voice, soft and coaxing, almost musical. I clenched my jaw, staring at the clock. 12:16. 4 minutes had crawled by since the bell first rang. The voice came again, closer now, right outside the door. "Please, it's cold out here." I didn't move. I didn't answer. The rules hadn't said anything about speaking, but I knew instinctively that opening my mouth would be a mistake. The doorknob rattled, my chest tightened, and then the bell rang again, shattering the sound. The voice cut off instantly. The footsteps faded. At 12:19, the office was silent once more. I stayed rigid in the chair until my muscles ached. At 12:47, the rec hall lights flickered again. My stomach sank. I didn't want to go back there. Not after what I saw last night, but I couldn't ignore it. I grabbed the flashlight and made my way across the camp. The night was darker this time, clouds smothering the stars, the forest stretching endlessly on either side. I pushed through the door of the rec hall and found the breaker box again. The lights flickered once, then went out. As I reached for the switch, I felt it, a presence behind me. The air shifted, colder, heavier. My skin prickled. Slowly, I turned my head. She was there again, the girl in the red dress, standing not at the far end of the hall this time, but only a few feet away. Her pale face caught in the dim glow of my flashlight, her hair matted and dripping, as though she had just crawled from the lake. Her lips parted, and I heard a sound like rushing water, like 1,000 whispers tangled together. My knees nearly buckled. I flicked the switch. The lights sputtered, blazed to life. She was gone. I didn't walk back to the office. I ran. My lungs burned, my legs shaking by the time I slammed the door behind me and locked it again. For the rest of the night, nothing else happened. No laughter, no bell, no girl. But the silence wasn't comforting anymore. It was worse. It was expectant, like the calm before a storm. At 2:33 a.m., the pressure lifted again. The air lightened, and just like last night, the shift ended as suddenly as it began. When Lawson arrived at dawn, he found me pale, shaking, my coffee gone cold on the desk. He studied me with those hollow eyes of his and finally said, "You followed the rules. Good." I wanted to demand answers. I wanted to ask what was happening in this place, what that girl was, who the voice belonged to. But when I opened my mouth, nothing came out. Because deep down, I already knew. The rules weren't to protect the camp. They were to protect me. And the things out there were only just getting started. By the third night, I had stopped pretending this was an ordinary job. The walk up the gravel road to the gate felt heavier, like the trees themselves leaned closer, watching me arrive. I kept glancing over my shoulder as if something followed just out of sight. When I reached the office, Lawson was waiting again. His face was unreadable in the half-light, his coat collar pulled high against the chill. He handed me a keyring with shaking hands, though his voice stayed steady. "You'll need these," he said. "Tonight might be worse." I stared at him, waiting for some explanation, some clue about what was coming. He didn't give me one. He only repeated, "Remember the rules," before leaving me alone again. The office felt colder that night. I kept the heater on full blast, but the air was still damp, seeping into my bones. At 10:15, I started pacing the room, unable to sit. Every creak of the wooden floorboards set my nerves on edge. I kept catching myself staring at the window toward cabin 6, fighting the urge to look. By midnight, I thought I had gone numb to the fear. I told myself that if I just stuck to the rules, I'd be fine. But when the clock struck 12, I realized how wrong I was. The laughter came again. Not faint this time, not drifting on the wind, but sharp and close, right outside the office walls. The giggles rose in unison, like a group of children pressing their faces to the glass. I froze where I stood, my eyes locked on the floor. The doorknob rattled. Tiny hands scraped against the wood. "Come play with us," a chorus of voices whispered. I clenched my fists and stared at the rules taped above the desk. I repeated them over and over in my head. Do not leave the office between 12 and 2:33. Do not investigate the laughter. Do not acknowledge them. The sound grew louder, shrill, almost painful, until I thought my eardrums would burst. Then, just as suddenly as it began, the laughter cut off. The silence was worse. At 12:23, the bell rang. The sound shook the walls, vibrating through my chest. I scrambled to lock the door, but this time it was already locked. The bell tolled again, and the voices came back. Not children now, but deeper, layered, wrong. The footsteps followed, crunching the gravel, circling the office. My breath came short and shallow. I sat on the floor behind the desk, my back pressed against the wall. The voice returned. The same woman as the night before, her tone sweet and coaxing. "Please, let me in." Her hand brushed the glass of the window. I could hear her nails dragging down the pane, a slow scrape that made my skin crawl. "You don't have to be alone," she whispered. "I can keep you company." I closed my eyes and pressed my hands over my ears. The bell rang again, louder, forcing my teeth to chatter. I thought my skull might split apart. And then, silence. At 12:34, I lifted my head. The woods were quiet. My heart still hammered, but nothing moved outside. I thought it was over until I saw the rec hall lights flicker again. My stomach dropped. I didn't want to go back there, not after the last 2 nights. But the rules were clear. I had no choice. I grabbed the flashlight and the new keys Lawson had given me and stepped outside. The air was heavy, damp, the kind that clung to your lungs. The walk to the rec hall felt longer than before, the trees pressing close on either side. I could swear I heard footsteps behind me, but every time I turned, the trail was empty. Inside the rec hall, the air was colder than outside. My flashlight cut across the tables and chairs, but this time they weren't empty. Dozens of wet footprints trailed across the wooden floor. Small footprints, like those of children, leading from the door toward the back wall. My pulse quickened. I followed the trail reluctantly, my hand shaking on the flashlight. The footprints ended at the far wall, where the old photographs of campers hung crooked in their frames. The pictures were faded, the faces smiling. But as I stared at them, something shifted. Their eyes were gone. Every single child in every photograph had empty sockets, black voids where eyes should have been. The lights sputtered out. I swung the flashlight around, panic rising in my throat. That's when I saw her again, the girl in the red dress. But this time, she wasn't alone. She stood in the middle of the room, dripping lake water, her face pale and cracked like porcelain. And behind her, shadows gathered. Children, dozens of them, faceless, their heads tilted at unnatural angles. Their laughter began again, low and distant, building until it filled the hall. I stumbled backward, fumbling for the breaker box. My fingers slipped, sweat slicking the switch. The laughter rose, echoing in my skull. The children began to move, their feet slapping wet against the wood, closing in. With a desperate yank, I slammed the switch. The lights blazed back to life. The hall was empty. No footprints, no shadows, no girl. Just silence. I collapsed against the wall, my chest heaving, my flashlight clattering to the floor. I stayed there for several minutes, afraid to move, afraid to breathe. Finally, I forced myself to leave, locking the rec hall door behind me with trembling hands. The walk back to the office was torture. Every shadow seemed to move. Every branch that cracked under my boots made me flinch. I didn't breathe easy until I was back inside with the door locked. At 1:17, the laughter came again, faint and distant this time. But it didn't approach. It lingered at the edges of the woods, circling the camp like wolves. I sat rigid in the chair, staring at the rules, whispering them under my breath like a prayer. At 2:33, the air shifted. The weight lifted. The silence returned, clean and natural, as though none of it had happened. When Lawson returned at dawn, I confronted him. My voice cracked, but I forced the words out. What is this place? What's happening here? He studied me for a long moment before finally speaking. This camp was built on blood, accidents, drownings, murders, too many to count. Their spirits never left. I swallowed hard. And the rules? His eyes darkened. The rules are the only thing keeping them from tearing you apart. He didn't stay to answer my questions. He simply turned and walked away, leaving me alone with the truth. The job wasn't just about watching an abandoned camp. It was about surviving it. And I wasn't sure how many more nights I could. By the fourth night, I felt like a man walking into his own grave. Every step along the gravel road toward the camp office filled me with dread, but there was nowhere else to go. Lawson hadn't asked me if I wanted to quit, and I didn't dare suggest it. Something about the way he looked at me each morning, those hollow, watchful eyes, told me that walking away wasn't really an option. I sat in the office long before my shift began, staring at the rules again and again. I thought I understood them, but after what I'd seen in the rec hall, after the voices outside the door, I realized the rules didn't explain everything. They weren't instructions. They were warnings, bare minimum survival tactics. What terrified me most was the thought of what wasn't written down. The night began with silence, thick and heavy. I almost preferred the laughter. At least then I knew where they were. This quiet pressed in on me, making me feel like the air itself was holding its breath. At 11:52, I heard something new. Water dripping. It started faint, a slow plink, 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 somewhere above me. I checked the ceiling, but the roof looked dry. The sound grew louder, sharper, until it echoed through the entire office. I realized with a shiver that it wasn't water at all. It was footsteps, wet and heavy, pacing above me in the attic. The office didn't even have an attic. I clenched my jaw and gripped the desk. The rules hadn't said anything about this, but I knew better than to investigate. I sat frozen, listening as the wet steps moved from one end of the ceiling to the other, dragging like someone soaked to the bone was wandering directly above my head. Then a child's voice whispered from the corner of the room. "Look." I nearly jumped out of my chair. My flashlight beam shook as I pointed it into the shadows. Nothing was there, but the whisper came again, closer this time. "Look." My stomach twisted. The window toward cabin 6 loomed in the corner of my eye. I squeezed my eyes shut. I wasn't going to look. Not at that window, not at whatever waited there. The dripping stopped. The footsteps fell silent. I sat stiff until the clock struck midnight, and then the true horrors began. The bell rang. I locked the door instantly, my hands moving on instinct now. The ringing was louder than ever, shaking the glass in its frames. I curled into the chair, waiting for the footsteps, for the woman's voice. But it wasn't a woman this time. It was children again. Their whispers filled the office, brushing against my ears, too close, too real. "Come outside. Play with us. You're all alone." I pressed my palms over my ears, but the whispers crawled into my skull. Then came the knock at the door. Not soft, not coaxing, but sharp, pounding, like small fists hammering against the wood. The voices rose in unison. "Let us in." My throat went dry. The bell tolled again, shaking me down to my bones. The pounding stopped. The whispers faded, but I didn't feel relief, because the office lights flickered and went out. I fumbled for the flashlight, my breath ragged, and swung the beam around the room. The air felt damp, freezing, and the smell of stagnant water filled my nose. The beam landed on the corner by the filing cabinet. She was there, the girl in the red dress, standing inside the office. Her hair dripped onto the floor, forming dark puddles that spread across the wood. Her pale face turned slowly toward me, her eyes black voids. My legs locked. My mouth opened, but no sound came. She stepped forward, her bare feet slapping wetly against the floor. The rules didn't say what to do if she came inside. I stumbled backward, crashing into the desk. The flashlight shook in my hand, the beam dancing across the walls. Her mouth opened, and from it came the same rushing sound I'd heard before, like the lake itself roaring to life. And then, just as suddenly as she appeared, the lights flickered back on. She was gone. I collapsed into the chair, gasping, sweat running down my temples despite the cold. My hands wouldn't stop shaking. I stayed there, staring at the floor, afraid that if I blinked, she would return. At 1:06, the rec hall lights flickered again. I wanted to cry. I didn't want to go back there. But the rules were the rules. Breaking them was worse. So I grabbed the keys and the flashlight, my legs trembling, and forced myself out into the night. The woods were darker than ever, the clouds thick over the moon. Every step toward the rec hall felt like a death march. Inside, the smell of mildew hit me hard. The lights were out again, buzzing faintly as they tried to hold on. I moved toward the breaker box, trying not to look at the walls. The photographs were still there, the children still smiling with their eyeless faces. As I reached for the switch, something moved in the reflection of the glass frame. I spun around, and my stomach dropped. Cabin 6. I could see it clearly through the rec hall window, even though the view shouldn't have been possible. And in the window of cabin 6 stood a figure. A man. His face was pale and twisted, his neck bent at a grotesque angle, his body swaying slowly as though hanging from a rope, his eyes locked on mine through the glass. I staggered back, the breath ripping from my lungs. The lights blazed on, blinding me. When I blinked the spots from my eyes, the view of cabin 6 was gone. Just the woods, just the darkness. I locked the rec hall door and ran, my legs carrying me faster than I thought possible. Back in the office, I bolted the door, shut off the flashlight, and pressed myself into the corner. At 2:33, the air shifted. The weight lifted. And again, silence returned. When Lawson arrived at dawn, I couldn't even form words. I just stared at him, waiting for him to explain. For the first time, his expression softened, almost pitying. "You saw her inside, didn't you?" he asked quietly. I nodded, my throat too dry to speak. He sighed, rubbing his temples. "Then it's getting worse. They're not supposed to cross into the office. If they did, it means the rules are starting to break." The words hollowed me out. If the rules didn't hold, then nothing would save me. The first time I saw the thing they called the Watcher, it wasn't with my eyes. It was with the reflection on the black surface of the lake. I was standing on the dock, shivering in the cold night air, trying to calm my nerves after another endless patrol through the cabins. The lake was glassy and silent, a perfect mirror. I leaned over and saw myself staring back. Then a tall, crooked figure stepped up behind me. I spun around. Nothing. But when I looked back at the water, the reflection remained. A warped silhouette towering, its head bent at an unnatural angle, like it was studying me. My stomach knotted, and I nearly tumbled into the water as I backed away. The rules came screaming into my mind. Don't look into the lake after midnight. I had broken it. That night, I didn't sleep. I sat on my bunk, gripping the flashlight until my knuckles went white. Every creak of the cabin made me flinch. At some point, I heard footsteps crunching outside, slow and deliberate. I couldn't bring myself to look. When morning came, the camp seemed normal again. Kids played in the distance, birds chirped, and sunlight warmed the damp wooden paths. But I knew something was watching me now. The next evening, Mr. Harlan handed me a clipboard with the roster of campers. His eyes lingered on me longer than usual. "Stay sharp tonight," he said, his voice low, almost like he was warning me rather than instructing me. "The woods will be restless." I wanted to ask what he meant, but I didn't. I had learned enough by now. Questions only made things worse. The sun dipped behind the tree line, and the camp slipped into its unnatural silence again. The kind of silence that wasn't empty but heavy, charged, as if dozens of unseen things were holding their breath. I checked the cabins as usual. The children were asleep, or at least pretending to be. But when I reached the last cabin, I froze. One of the beds was empty. I counted again, my heart thundering. 8 bunks, but only 7 campers. The missing one was a boy named Caleb. I rushed outside, scanning the tree line, the pathways, the dock, the cafeteria, but nothing. I knew I should have reported it immediately, but fear anchored me in place. I remembered another rule, one that I had dismissed earlier as nonsense. If a camper goes missing at night, don't go looking. My instincts fought with the rules. He was just a kid. He couldn't survive out there in the woods at night. That was when I heard it. A faint humming, almost like a lullaby, drifting from the edge of the forest. It wasn't a child's voice. It was deeper, older, broken, as if the throat making it had long since rotted away. And then I saw him. Caleb, standing at the tree line, still in his pajamas, his head tilted to the side, his eyes wide and blank, fixed on me. "Caleb!" I hissed, waving for him. "Come here." Now! He didn't move. Behind him, something shifted. The trees seemed to bend around a figure that wasn't quite solid, a mass of shadow and crooked limbs. It leaned down as if whispering to him. I froze, paralyzed. My brain screamed at me to act, but my body refused to obey. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, the humming stopped. Caleb blinked. His eyes cleared for a moment. His lips parted like he wanted to say something, but the shadow figure pressed a long, gnarled finger to his mouth. Caleb's voice died in his throat. I couldn't take it anymore. I lunged forward, but before I reached the tree line, Caleb was gone. The figure had pulled him into the dark, swallowed by the trees without a sound. The woods grew still again. I collapsed to my knees, my flashlight shaking in my grip. I wanted to scream, but no sound came. I just stared at the empty space where he had been. The rules had been right. Don't go looking. But now Caleb was gone. And I had no idea how I was supposed to explain that when morning came. The night at Camp Carnage felt heavier than any I had lived through before. It wasn't just fear pressing down on me anymore. It was inevitability. The woods themselves seemed to breathe, and every tree around me leaned as though waiting for me to make one wrong move. I clutched the rule sheet in my trembling hand, but the words had already carved themselves into my memory. They weren't just rules anymore. They were a curse etched onto my existence. After the ordeal with the well and the sight of things crawling out from it, I had retreated to the cabin and locked the doors. But my safety was an illusion. The scratching at the wood started minutes later. Long, deliberate drags of claws against the planks. The sound wasn't frantic like an animal. It was calculated, like something reminding me it could come in whenever it wanted. I shoved the dresser against the door and backed toward the cot. My flashlight flickered, dimming as though even the batteries were afraid of the dark pressing against the cabin. I didn't dare close my eyes. Every time I blinked, I saw her face, the girl who had smiled at me at the campfire, the one who vanished into the woods, the one whose voice I had heard whispering my name in the mist. But she wasn't a girl anymore. Whatever lived in her skin now wasn't human. Sometime past midnight, the scratching stopped. Silence fell over the camp, but it wasn't a peaceful quiet. It was the silence of a predator hiding, waiting. Then I remembered rule number 9. If the scratching stops, it means they're inside. The air turned cold, my breath visible in the beam of my weak flashlight. I forced myself to turn my head slowly, scanning the room. That's when I saw her. She stood in the far corner of the cabin, her head tilted, her hair dripping with something thick and dark. Her eyes reflected the beam of my light like a wild animal's, and her lips stretched into an impossibly wide smile. "You're not following the rules right," she said in a voice that was almost hers, but too broken, too hollow. I stumbled back, clutching the flashlight like a weapon. "Stay away." She giggled, and the sound wasn't human. It was layered, like 10 voices laughing at once. "You'll never leave, you know. None of us do. That's why the rules exist. They're not to protect you, they're to keep you useful." My chest tightened as she stepped closer, her bare feet leaving wet prints on the wooden floor. Behind her, shadows stretched unnaturally, writhing like living things. I remembered the last rule, the one I hadn't dared to say aloud. If you survive until dawn, do not look at the sunrise. The sunrise here is not for you. My eyes flicked to the window. The horizon was still drowned in black, but I could see the faintest hint of gray trying to push through. If I could just hold on, if I could just make it to morning. She crept closer, whispering words I couldn't understand, words that clawed at my brain like hooks. I pressed my hands to my ears, but the sound burrowed deeper inside me. My vision blurred, my knees buckled, and then the bell rang. It was the same rusted bell that had rung at the start of my first night, but now it tolled with a sound that shook the entire camp. She froze mid-step, her grin fading, her head snapping toward the sound as though yanked by invisible strings. The shadows behind her recoiled. Her voice dropped to a guttural hiss. "They're calling you." The bell rang again, and the air shifted. The cabin door creaked open on its own, the dresser sliding back across the floor as if shoved by invisible hands. Outside, the mist parted just enough to reveal the campfire circle, glowing faintly. Figures gathered there, dozens of them, their silhouettes wavering in the fog. The girl vanished. I knew I should stay inside. Every instinct screamed at me not to step outside. But something pulled me forward, like the rules themselves demanded my presence. My feet carried me into the night, across the damp earth, until I stood at the edge of the fire pit. The figures became clearer. Counselors, children, faces I had glimpsed around the camp, faces I thought had disappeared into the woods forever. They sat in silence, eyes fixed on me. The fire wasn't normal. It burned blue, its flames rising and twisting like skeletal hands. A tall figure stepped forward from the crowd, draped in what looked like animal skins stitched together. Its face was hidden behind a mask made of bone. It raised one long, clawed hand and pointed at me. "You broke the rules," it said. Its voice was the same layered sound I had heard in the girl's laughter. "No," I stammered. "I followed them. I followed all of them." The masked figure tilted its head. "You hesitated. You questioned. The rules are not meant to be understood. They are meant to be obeyed." The crowd around the fire murmured in agreement, their voices overlapping in a chorus of whispers that made my skin crawl. The figure raised its hand higher, and the flames surged. In the firelight, I saw glimpses of the well, the cabins, the trees, every rule carved into reality around me. They weren't instructions. They were chains, binding this place together. "You belong to the night now," the figure said, "and the night belongs to us." I tried to run, but my legs wouldn't move. The ground beneath me softened, turning into something slick and pulsing, like flesh. My feet sank into it, holding me in place. The crowd leaned forward, their eyes glowing faintly in the blue firelight. Then the horizon broke. Dawn spilled across the treetops, but it wasn't sunlight. It was red, bleeding across the sky like a wound opening. I remembered the final rule too late. The figures raised their hands in unison, their whispers growing louder. My head tilted on its own, my eyes dragging upward toward the unnatural sunrise. It wasn't a sun at all. It was an eye, enormous, bloodshot, staring down at me from the heavens. Its gaze burned into my skull, filling me with a terror beyond anything I had felt before. My body convulsed, my vision shattered into pieces of impossible colors. The last thing I remember was the crowd chanting as my mind cracked open like glass. When I woke, I was standing at the camp entrance. The sun, if it was truly the sun, hung normally in the sky. The cabins were quiet, the mist was gone, my shift was over, but the rule sheet was still in my hand and the ink had changed. It wasn't just rules anymore, it was a contract. At the bottom, beneath the twisted handwriting, my name had been signed in blood. I don't know if I'm free. I don't know if I'll ever be free. All I know is that night will come again, and when it does, I'll be back at Camp Carnage. Because once you take the job, you never really leave. And that, my friends, was just one night at Camp Carnage, a place where rules are written in blood, and breaking them means you may never leave. If you survive this tale, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Your support keeps the fire burning and the stories alive. And tell me in the comments, which rule would you be most afraid to break? Until next time, keep your lights low and your doors locked.